The stop-and-go parking lot stretched out a desolate expanse under the flickering streetlights. I pulled in 15 minutes early for my shift, the familiar knot of anxiety already tightening in my stomach. As a single mother of two, this job wasn't just a paycheck. It was the lifeline that kept Emma and Jacob fed, clothed, and safe. The pay here, nearly double what other convenience stores in Riverdale offered, was a blessing, a miracle. But I knew deep down that such a blessing always came with a hidden cost. My gaze drifted across the lot, catching on a jarring sight, a beat-up blue sedan parked so crookedly it straddled two spaces. The new guy. Management had mentioned him yesterday, a casual aside about training someone tonight. My stomach clenched a little tighter. The car door creaked open, and out stepped a young man. His hair was a chaotic mess, a stark contrast to the crisp ironed uniforms I was used to seeing. His own uniform shirt was wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. One hand clutched a phone, its screen glowing faintly. The other cradled a large, garish energy drink. He moved with an easy, almost careless confidence that immediately set my teeth on edge. He spotted me as I got out of my car, a wide, disarming smile spreading across his face. He stuck out a hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Mark Carter," he said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet night. "You must be Samantha." I nodded, shaking his hand briefly, the contact feeling oddly cold despite the warmth of the evening. I pulled my hand back quickly, already turning towards the store entrance. "Just call me Sam," I replied. My voice clipped. "Let's get inside and I'll show you around." There was no time for pleasantries, not here. The fluorescent lights inside the stop-and-go buzzed overhead, a low, constant hum that usually faded into the background, but tonight felt amplified, almost oppressive. I fumbled with the keys, the metal cold against my fingertips, and unlocked the front door. The click of the lock echoed in the stillness. The night manager, Thomas, wouldn't arrive until much later, leaving me plenty of time to cover the basics with Mark. And by basics, I meant the rules. The very important rules that kept us alive. Mark followed me inside, his footsteps surprisingly light. "So Mark," he began, his tone still too casual. "Thomas said you've been here a while." "3 years, I answered, walking behind the counter. The familiar routine was a small comfort. I pulled open the locked drawer where employees kept their belongings, dropping my purse inside. Which means I've outlasted about 12 other employees who didn't take this job seriously. Mark laughed, a short, sharp sound that grated on my nerves. He clearly thought I was joking. I wasn't. I turned to face him, my expression hardening. "All right, before we get to register training, there are some store-specific rules you need to know." I watched his face, searching for any flicker of understanding, any hint that he grasped the gravity of my words. Rule number 1, never work alone, no matter what. Even if someone calls in sick, you call me or another employee before starting your shift solo. Mark nodded, fiddling with his name tag. "Sure, makes sense. Safety and numbers and all that?" I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping firm and unwavering. "This isn't about robbery prevention." His smile faltered just a fraction. 2 years ago, a guy named Jason decided to cover an overnight shift by himself when his partner called in sick. The security cameras showed him working normally until 2:17 a.m. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy between us. When he looked up at something off camera and then walked into the storage room, he never came out. Mark's smile vanished completely. His eyes, previously bright with an easygoing indifference, now held a flicker of something else. "What, like he stole something and ran out the back?" He tried to sound dismissive, but there was a tremor in his voice. I shook my head slowly, deliberately. The back door was locked from the inside. All his belongings were still here. His car was still in the parking lot. He just vanished. "That's..." Mark started, then shrugged, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Weird coincidence, I guess." I could already tell this was going to be difficult. Some people just wouldn't believe until they saw for themselves. And even then, they'd try to explain it away. I'd seen it before with other new hires. The chilling certainty in my gut told me Mark was one of them. "Let me show you the store layout," I said, changing tactics. I'd come back to the rules throughout the shift as relevant situations came up. They always did. I led Mark through the aisles, the fluorescent hum still a low thrum above us. My voice, usually calm and steady, felt a little too sharp as I pointed out where everything was stocked. how to check expiration dates and the proper rotation procedures. He seemed smart enough, asking surprisingly good questions about inventory, picking things up quickly. A part of me, the part that desperately wanted this to be an easy night, hoped he was just a skeptic, not a fool. When we reached the refrigerated section, the cold air a stark contrast to the stale warmth of the store, I handed him a box of energy drinks to restock. The metallic clink of cans against the shelves filled the brief silence. "So, why is the pay so good here?" Mark asked, his voice echoing slightly in the cooler. He arranged cans in neat rows, his movements surprisingly precise. "Most places like this pay minimum wage, the unusual hours." I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it was far from the whole truth. "And the special circumstances." "Special circumstances?" He repeated, his head tilting slightly, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Before I could answer, a sound ripped through the quiet of the store. A loud, grating, scratching noise. It came from the direction of the bathroom, a slow, deliberate drag, like fingernails being drawn across the inside of the door. My breath hitched. Mark froze his hand, still on a can of energy drink. He turned slowly towards the sound, his eyes wide. "What's that?" he asked, already taking a step away from the cooler, a primal instinct kicking in. I moved without thinking, grabbing his arm firmly, my fingers digging into his bicep. "Rule 5. I hissed, my voice barely a whisper, urgent and raw. "Never investigate bathroom noises between 10:00 p.m. and 5:00 a.m. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, a relentless scraping rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. Mark pulled away from my grasp, his eyes fixed on the bathroom door. "Someone might need help," he said, his voice laced with a desperate concern, and he moved towards the bathroom. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path with my body, my arms outstretched. "No, trust me on this. We don't check bathroom noises. Not ever." "Come on. That's ridiculous," Mark said, trying to step around me, his frustration mounting. "What if a customer fell or something? The bathroom is empty." My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I checked it before we closed the cooler section, which is standard procedure. There is no one in there." I stood my ground, arms crossed, my gaze unwavering. The scratching stopped suddenly, the abrupt silence more terrifying than the noise itself. It was replaced by a soft, mournful crying sound. It might have been a child. A small, whimpering sob that seemed to tug at something deep inside. Mark's eyes got wide, a genuine fear now etched on his face. "Do you hear that? That sounds like a kid." He tried to push past me, his resolve hardening. I planted my feet firmly, putting both hands on his chest to stop him. "It's not a kid. It's never a kid. That's how it tricks you." For the first time, I saw uncertainty in Mark's face, a flicker of doubt that pierced through his usual bravado. The crying continued for another 30 seconds, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of the refrigerators. "What was that?" Mark finally asked, his voice barely a whisper, stripped of all its earlier cockiness. "That," I said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning, "is why we get paid so well." As we continued the training, the air between us was thick with unspoken questions. I explained more of the rules, each one a chilling fragment of the store's hidden reality. Rule 2, no alcohol sales after 2:00 a.m., even if the customer threatens you or offers extra money. Mark listened with growing doubt, a faint smirk returning to his lips. These sound like urban legends or horror movie rules. Rule 4. I continued, ignoring his comment, my gaze fixed on his is crucial. When regular customers come in acting strange, walking oddly, speaking in a flat voice, or just seeming off, they're not themselves anymore. Don't talk to them. Don't look them in the eye. And definitely don't let them touch you. "Not themselves." Mark laughed, a short, nervous sound. "What does that even mean?" "It means exactly what I said," I replied flatly. "You'll understand when you see it." As the evening wore on, I showed Mark how to clean the coffee station, run inventory reports, and handle the register. Throughout it all, I continued explaining the various rules and procedures unique to our store. Each time, his responses got more dismissive, more incredulous. "So let me get this straight," he said as I explained the 11 p.m. protocol. "Every night at exactly 11 p.m., we have to lock the front doors even if customers are still shopping." "Yes," I confirmed. "At 10:58, we warn any remaining customers that we need to lock up temporarily. Any stragglers are walked out through the employee exit at the back, and this is official store policy. Locking customers in or kicking them out at 11:0. He raised an eyebrow, a mocking glint in his eyes. It's not locking them in, it's locking other things out. I said, my voice low and serious. And yes, it's official policy. Thomas will tell you the same thing. Mark shook his head, a dismissive wave of his hand. This is just horror movie nonsense. Next you'll tell me there's a full moon rule or something about not getting wet after midnight. I sighed, a deep, weary sound. Emma was more willing to listen to important instructions than this grown man. Even Jacob knew when to take things seriously. Look, I said, my voice softening, a plea in my tone. I have 2 kids at home who need me. Emma and Jacob don't have anyone else. I follow these rules because I want to go home to them every morning. Whether you believe in the reasons or not, follow the procedures. That's all I'm asking. Mark's face softened slightly at the mention of my children, but the doubt remained a stubborn shadow in his eyes. At 9:45 p.m., the bell above the door chimed a sharp, clear sound that cut through the quiet. A customer entered. I immediately recognized the tall figure in the black hoodie. Mark tensed beside me, his hand slowly reaching for the phone. It's okay, I said quietly, moving to the coffee machine. I poured a large black coffee and placed it on the counter, not making any move to ring it up. The tall man nodded almost invisibly and took the coffee. I could feel Mark staring, his gaze fixed on the man as he walked to the far corner of the store and seemed to blend into the shadows. What was that? Mark whispered, his voice hushed with a mixture of confusion and unease. Why didn't you charge him? That's William. I explained, my voice low. He helps with problems. The free coffee is a courtesy. Helps with what problems? Mark pressed, his curiosity piqued. The kind that make the rules necessary. I answered, simply leaving the words hanging in the air, a chilling promise of what was to come. For the rest of our shift, Mark continued learning the register system and stocking procedures. William stayed in his corner, a silent, watchful presence, occasionally shifting to different areas of the store, but never speaking. Just before our shift ended, the tall man placed his empty cup on the counter and left without a word, the bell chiming his departure. That guy gives me the creeps, Mark said once William was gone, a nervous laugh escaping him. And all these rules. I've worked night shifts before, and sure, weird customers come in, but there's nothing supernatural about it. I finished counting my register, the crisp bills a stark contrast to the unsettling conversation. I looked at Mark directly, my gaze unwavering. I'm not asking you to believe in the supernatural. I'm asking you to follow the procedures that have kept employees at this store alive. Mark laughed again, shaking his head, a dismissive gesture that sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Right. Mysterious disappearances and things that are not themselves. Listen, I appreciate you trying to make the night interesting, but I'm a bit old for ghost stories. As we left the store and headed to our cars, a cold knot of worry tightened in my stomach. I'd seen this attitude before, and it never ended well. People who dismissed the rules tended not to last long at the stop and go. Just be careful, okay? I said as we reached the parking lot, the darkness pressing in around us. And remember, never work alone. Sure thing, boss, Mark replied with a mock salute, a smirk playing on his lips. I'll make sure to check for monsters under the cash register too. I watched him drive away, the knot in my stomach getting tighter, a premonition of something terrible. I needed to pick up Emma and Jacob from my neighbor's house, get them to bed, and somehow get some sleep myself before doing this all again tomorrow night. As I started my car, the engine sputtering to life, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's training had been inadequate. Not because I hadn't tried, but because he simply wouldn't listen. Some people had to learn the hard way. I just hoped Mark would survive the lesson. 3 days had passed since Mark's first shift, and I was already exhausted from his constant dismissal of everything I tried to teach him. Tonight was no different as I watched him carelessly tossing energy drinks onto the shelf instead of arranging them properly. You're going to break one of those if you keep throwing them, I said, moving to fix his sloppy work. Mark shrugged. They're cans. They'll be fine. I bit back a sharper response. My kid's babysitter had called in sick today, forcing me to drop Emma and Jacob at my mother's house across town. The extra driving had left me with barely 4 hours of sleep, and my patience was wearing thin. Let's go over Rule 2 again, I said, moving toward the liquor section. No alcohol sales after 2:00 a.m., even Even if they offer me $1 million or threaten to kill me. Mark interrupted, mimicking my serious tone before switching back to his casual one. Yeah, I got it the first 3 times. I stopped walking and turned to face him directly, my voice low and steady, a chilling calm. This isn't a joke, Mark. 2 months ago, a guy offered one of our cashiers $500 for a bottle of whiskey at 2:30 a.m. She took the money. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken horror. No, she sold him the bottle. He left, and 10 minutes later he walked back in, except it wasn't him anymore. My voice remained steady, a chilling monotone. Whatever came back wearing his face broke both her arms before William intervened. Mark rolled his eyes, a dismissive gesture. More superstitious garbage. There's probably some logical explanation, like the guy was on drugs or something. The security footage showed him walking through the closed door, Mark. Not opening it, walking through it. Security footage gets glitchy all the time, he said dismissively, a forced laugh escaping him. I'm not buying into this horror movie stuff just because this place has some weird vibes. The front door chimed, a sudden sharp sound that cut through the tension. I looked up. Karen Mitchell was entering the store. She came in every day at the same time to buy her lottery tickets, except something was wrong tonight. Very wrong. Karen's body moved in jerky, uneven steps, a puppet with tangled strings. But the truly disturbing part was her neck. It was bent at an angle that no human spine could possibly achieve without breaking. Her head tilted almost completely sideways, nearly touching her shoulder. Yet she continued walking forward, her movements unnervingly deliberate. I grabbed Mark's arm hard enough to make him wince. What the... he started to say. Remember Rule 4. I whispered urgently, my eyes fixed on Karen. When regulars act strange, they're not themselves anymore. Mark stared at Karen, his usual smirk faltering as the elderly woman moved deeper into the store. Her head remained at that impossible angle, but now her eyes, previously fixed straight ahead, swiveled in their sockets to look directly at us without her face turning. A cold dread seeped into the air. That's just Karen, Mark whispered back, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, a tremor of fear. Maybe she has a medical condition or something. That's not Karen anymore, I said firmly, pulling him toward the back room. We need to go now. For once, Mark didn't argue. We retreated to the employee area, and I closed the door behind us, leaving it open just a crack so I could monitor the situation. What are we doing? Mark asked, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual bravado. We can't just hide back here. We wait until she leaves. I explained, my eyes glued to the crack in the door. Whatever's wearing Karen right now will get bored and go away if we don't engage. Through the crack, I watched as not Karen moved through the aisles with that weird, jerky walk. She picked up items, looked at them while tilting her head at that impossible angle, and put them back in the wrong places. It felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes before she walked to the door and left without buying anything. I waited another full minute, the silence stretching before opening the door. All clear, I said, stepping back into the store. Mark followed, looking around cautiously, his eyes darting nervously. That was weird, but she could have some kind of neck problem. My aunt had this thing where... Mark, I cut him off, my voice sharp. Normal people with neck problems can't turn their heads 90 degrees to the side while keeping their bodies facing forward. What we just saw wasn't human anymore. He didn't have a quick comeback this time, and I counted that as progress. The chilling reality of what he'd witnessed seemed to have finally pierced his stubborn disbelief, if only for a moment. The rest of our shift continued without incident, a deceptive calm after the unsettling encounter with not Karen. Mark was quieter, his usual flippancy replaced by a subdued watchfulness. He kept glancing at the front door, then at me, as if trying to reconcile what he'd seen with his ingrained skepticism. I counted that as progress, a small victory in the ongoing battle against his disbelief. The clock on the wall ticked steadily towards 11:00 p.m., the hour of the lockdown. At 10:55 p.m., Joseph Rodriguez walked in. Joseph was a regular, a tired-looking man who often stopped by after his late shift at the factory across town. Evening, Sam. He greeted me with a weary smile, heading straight for the snack aisle. Hi, Joseph. Just so you know, we'll be locking the doors in a few minutes. I warned him, my voice calm, betraying none of the tension coiling in my gut. He nodded absently, already browsing the chip selection, seemingly unconcerned about the time. Mark looked at me with confusion, his brow furrowed. Why are we locking the doors? We're open 24/7. Rule 6. I reminded him, my gaze fixed on the clock. At exactly 11 p.m., we locked the front doors. No exceptions. I moved to the entrance keys in hand, watching the seconds tick by on my phone. Joseph was still browsing, oblivious. "This is ridiculous," Mark muttered, his voice low, a hint of his old defiance returning. "We can't just lock a customer inside." "We have exactly 2 minutes," I replied, not taking my eyes off the time. At 10:58, we warn any remaining customers. At 11:00 sharp, those doors get locked, whether people are inside or not. I walked over to Joseph, my steps deliberate. "Sir, I need to lock the front doors in 2 minutes. If you're not finished shopping by then, I'll have to let you out through our employee exit in the back." Joseph grabbed a bag of chips and a soda. "No problem, I'll be quick." He smiled, a tired, reassuring gesture. At 10:59, Joseph was still at the register with Mark, who was ringing him up. I stood by the door's keys ready, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Mark, hurry it up," I called over my shoulder, my voice tight with urgency. "He's paying Sam. Give us a second," Mark replied with annoyance, his tone dismissive. The clock on my phone changed to 11:00 p.m. precisely. Without a moment's hesitation, I immediately locked both deadbolts on the front doors. The metallic clicks echoed in the sudden heavy silence. Through the glass, I could see the parking lot was empty except for our cars, but the darkness beyond the lot's edge seemed deeper than usual, a suffocating void. "Come on," I said to Joseph once he had his items, my voice hushed. "I'll show you out the back way." Mark watched with obvious disapproval as I led Joseph through the employee area to our special exit. A door with additional locks and symbols etched into the frame that most people never noticed. "Thank you," Joseph said as he stepped outside, his voice fading into the night. I quickly closed and locked the door behind him, the heavy thud of the bolt a final chilling punctuation. When I returned to the front, Mark was staring at me. His arms crossed, a mixture of disbelief and irritation on his face. "You know how insane that looked, right? Locking the doors at exactly 11 and making the poor guy leave through the back like we're running some kind of secret operation." "We are running a secret operation," I said simply, my gaze unwavering. "And the doors stay locked until 5:00 a.m. Mark shook his head, a frustrated sigh escaping him. "What happens at 11:00 p.m.? That's so dangerous. In 3 days I haven't seen anything except an old lady with a stiff neck." "You don't want to see what happens when the doors aren't locked at 11:00, I said, my voice low, a chilling promise. "Trust me on that." The rest of the night was quiet, a tense, uneasy calm. Mark cleaned the coffee station while I restocked the cigarettes behind the counter. Around 1:40 a.m., Mark moved to the supply closet with cleaning supplies. I was checking inventory on my tablet when I heard Mark's voice from across the store. "Hey Sam, do you hear that?" I looked up to see him standing near the supply closet, his head tilted towards the door. I walked over quickly, already knowing what he was hearing before I got there. Faint crying like a child in distress was coming from inside the closet. "It sounds like a kid," Mark said, his hand reaching for the door handle. "Maybe they got locked in somehow." I moved to stop him, but before I could reach him, a tall figure appeared directly behind Mark. William had materialized silently, seemingly from nowhere. "Don't," William said quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Mark jumped back with a startled yelp, nearly colliding with me. His eyes were wide as he stared at William, who stood perfectly still between Mark and the closet door. "Jesus Christ!" Mark gasped, his voice a strained whisper. "Where did you come from?" William didn't answer. He never did. Instead, he placed one hand flat against the closet door, and the crying sound immediately stopped. The silence that followed was absolute chilling. "Mark, this is William," I said, watching as the color slowly returned to Mark's face. "I told you about him on your first night. He protects us." "Protects us from what?" Mark asked, his voice uncharacteristically small, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. William turned his hooded head slightly toward Mark. His face was hidden in the shadows of his hood, an enigma. "From what exists beyond the rules," he said in a deep, quiet voice. It was the most I'd ever heard William speak at once. He took his hand off the door and walked away to his usual corner, a silent sentinel once more. Mark watched him go, then looked at me. For the first time since I'd met him, he didn't look smug at all. His eyes held a raw, unadulterated fear. "What the hell is going on in this place, Sam?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I've been trying to tell you, I said the words heavy with the weight of the night's events. The rules aren't superstition. They're survival. Mark looked back at the supply closet, which was now completely silent. And if I had opened that door, he asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer immediately, remembering the night shift worker 2 years ago who had done exactly that. We never found enough of him to hold a funeral. Let's just say you wouldn't be finishing your shift. I finally replied, my voice flat. And I'd be training someone new tomorrow. Mark was quieter for the rest of the night. He still didn't fully believe. I could tell he was still doubtful as time went on, but at least now he was thinking about it. Sometimes just getting someone to question their disbelief is all you need. As our shift ended and the morning crew arrived, I grabbed my stuff and headed for the door with Mark walking behind me. "Sam," he said, as we reached our cars, the first rays of dawn painting the sky. "That thing with William tonight. I can't explain that." "You don't need to explain it," I replied. "You just need to respect it." I paused, looking at him. But the crying in the closet was not a child. I finished for him, the words hanging in the crisp morning air. "It's never a child." Mark nodded slowly, a haunted look in his eyes. "I'll see you tomorrow night then." I watched him drive away, hoping that tonight's events had finally gotten through to him. The rules kept us alive, but only if we followed them. And I had the feeling Mark was still deciding whether to believe. The next few shifts with Mark were different. The cocky smirk was gone, replaced by a cautious frown. He still questioned the rules, but his tone was less dismissive, more genuinely curious, tinged with a nascent fear. He'd ask things like, "So if William is here, why do we still need to lock the doors at 11? Or what exactly is William?" I never gave him direct answers, just vague, unsettling truths. "William is a protector," I'd say. "And the doors are locked because William can't be everywhere at once." One night as we were restocking the candy aisle, the air in the store grew heavy, thick, with an unnatural stillness. The fluorescent hum seemed to fade, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible vibration that resonated in my teeth. I felt the familiar prickle of dread on my skin. Mark, who had been humming a pop song, suddenly stopped. He looked around, his eyes wide. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the ceiling directly above the snack aisle. It wasn't a normal shadow. It was too dark, too dense, moving with an unnatural fluidity. It stretched, elongated, then seemed to flow down the wall, pooling on the floor like spilled ink. Mark gasped, taking a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for my arm. The shadow began to spread slowly at first, then with increasing speed, creeping across the linoleum tiles towards us. It seemed to absorb the light, making the already dim aisle even darker. I could feel the temperature drop, a sudden bone-chilling cold that seeped into my clothes. "Rule 7. I whispered, my voice tight with urgency. "If the shadows move, don't let them touch you. Get to the counter. Now." Mark didn't argue. He didn't even question it. He just turned and ran a desperate scramble for the relative safety of the brightly lit counter area. I followed, my eyes fixed on the spreading darkness. It moved with an unsettling intelligence, flowing around shelves, stretching tendrils towards our retreating figures. We reached the counter, breathless, our backs pressed against the cool metal. The shadow stopped at the edge of the snack aisle, a few feet from the counter, as if an invisible barrier prevented it from crossing. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, like a living, breathing entity. "What is that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. I didn't answer. I just watched the shadow, my hand instinctively reaching for the small, heavy device I kept hidden beneath the counter. A last resort, a tool Thomas had given me for emergencies. It was a small, cylindrical object, cool and smooth to the touch, with a single glowing blue button. I had never had to use it before. The shadow began to writhe, its form shifting, twisting into grotesque, indistinct shapes. It seemed to be trying to push past the invisible barrier, its edges rippling like water. A low, guttural growl emanated from it, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, at once vibrating in my chest. Suddenly, William appeared. He materialized between us and the shadow, his back to us, facing the darkness. He stood perfectly still, a silent, unmoving sentinel. The shadow recoiled slightly, its movements becoming less aggressive. William raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed a finger at the shadow. A faint shimmering blue light emanated from his fingertip, a barely visible aura that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. The shadow hissed a sound like air escaping a punctured tire and began to recede slowly at first, then gathering speed, flowing back towards the ceiling. It climbed the wall, shrinking until it vanished back into the corner from which it had emerged. The air immediately felt lighter, the oppressive cold lifting. The fluorescent hum returned to its normal level. The store was quiet once more, save for our ragged breathing. Mark stared at the empty corner, then at William, who remained standing, his back to us. He just made it go away. Mark stammered, his voice filled with awe and terror. William turned his hooded head, tilting slightly towards Mark, then towards me. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then melted back into the shadows near the front door, becoming indistinguishable from the darkness. "What was that thing?" Mark asked again, his voice still shaky. "And what did William do?" "That was a shadow walker," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "And William, he reminded it where it belongs." I didn't elaborate. There was no need. Mark had seen it with his own eyes. He had felt the cold, heard the growl, witnessed William's silent power. For the rest of the night, Mark was completely silent. He followed every instruction, every procedure, without question or comment. His eyes darted nervously into every dark corner, every aisle. The casual confidence he'd arrived with was completely shattered, replaced by a raw, palpable fear. He was no longer just a skeptic. He was a believer. A terrified, wide-eyed believer. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky and the morning crew arrived, Mark looked utterly drained. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sam," he said as we walked out to the parking lot, his voice barely a whisper. I think I understand now." I just nodded, my own exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "Good," I said, "because it only gets worse from here." I watched him get into his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't offer a mock salute this time. He just drove away, leaving me alone in the growing light, the chilling memory of the shifting shadow still fresh in my mind. The stop and go had claimed another believer, and I knew with a cold certainty that this was just the beginning. The days following the Shadow Walker incident blurred into a tense, uneasy rhythm. Mark was a changed man. The casual indifference had evaporated, replaced by a hyper-vigilance that mirrored my own. He still asked questions, but now they were hushed, urgent, filled with a genuine desire to understand, to survive. "What if William isn't here?" He'd whisper, his eyes darting to the empty corner where William usually stood. "What do we do then?" I'd just shrug, a grim acceptance of the unknown. "We do what we always do. We follow the rules, and we hope." One night, the air in the store felt particularly heavy, thick, with an almost palpable dread. The usual hum of the refrigerators seemed to deepen, becoming a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor. I was restocking the snack aisle, my movements precise, almost mechanical, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. I froze, my hand still on a bag of chips. Mark, who was at the register, looked up, his head cocked to one side. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The whispering grew louder, coalescing into distinct guttural sounds, though no words were discernible. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and malevolent, seeping from the very fabric of the building. It felt like the walls were breathing, exhaling secrets from a forgotten past. "Rule 8. I said, my voice low and steady, a practiced calm masking the ice in my veins. "If the walls whisper, don't listen. Don't try to understand. Just keep moving." Mark for once didn't question. He just nodded, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. We continued our tasks, moving through the store, but the whispering followed us, a relentless, insidious presence. It seemed to grow louder when we were near the back of the store, near the storage room, near the bathroom. As I walked past the bathroom door, the whispering intensified, becoming a cacophony of distorted sounds, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, just beyond the threshold of human comprehension. I felt a strange pull, a morbid curiosity, urging me to lean closer to try and decipher the words. My hand instinctively reached for the doorknob, a primal urge to understand, to confront. "Sam." Mark's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the oppressive sound. He was standing at the end of the aisle, his face pale, his eyes fixed on me. "Don't..." His voice broke through the trance. I pulled my hand back, my fingers tingling as if I had touched something electrified. The whispering in the bathroom seemed to swell in response, a frustrated, angry roar that vibrated through the floor. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "It tries to lure you in," I said, my voice flat. "It wants you to listen. It wants you to understand." I didn't need to explain what would happen if you did. The memory of Jason, the employee who vanished, was a constant chilling reminder. We continued our shift, the whispering, a constant unsettling backdrop. It never stopped, never faded, just ebbed and flowed, a living, breathing entity within the walls of the stop and go. Mark kept glancing at the walls, his eyes wide, his movements jerky. He was clearly struggling to ignore it, to not listen. Around 3:00 a.m., the whispering reached a fever pitch. It was no longer just a chorus of voices. It was a symphony of screams, of guttural growls, of desperate pleas. It felt like the store was alive, writhing in agony, or perhaps in ecstasy. The lights flickered violently, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the contorted forms of unseen entities. Suddenly, a section of the wall near the back of the store where the cleaning supplies were kept began to bulge inwards. A slow, sickening creak echoed through the store as the plaster cracked, a spiderweb of fissures spreading across the surface. A dark, viscous liquid, thick and black like crude oil, began to seep from the cracks, dripping onto the floor with a soft, rhythmic plink, plink, plink. Mark gasped, his eyes fixed on the oozing wall. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of the whispers. I didn't answer. I just stared at the wall, a cold dread settling deep in my bones. This was new. This was different. The entities weren't just trying to lure us in anymore. They were trying to break through. William appeared, materializing silently between us and the oozing wall. He stood perfectly still, his hooded head tilted slightly towards the wall as if listening to the whispers. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and placed his palm flat against the bulging plaster. A low, resonant hum emanated from William, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, pushing back against the oppressive whispers. The black liquid stopped oozing, and the cracks in the wall seemed to freeze in place. William stood there for a long moment, his hand pressed against the wall, a silent battle being waged between him and the unseen forces. Then, with a soft sigh that seemed to ripple through the air, William removed his hand. The whispers immediately faded, receding back into the walls, becoming a faint, almost imperceptible hum once more. The cracks in the wall remained, but the black liquid had stopped. William turned, his hooded head tilting towards us. Then he melted back into the shadows near the front door, his silent vigil resumed. Mark stared at the wall, then at the spot where William had been, his face a mask of utter disbelief and terror. He stopped it," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "He actually stopped it." "For now," I said, my voice flat. The cracks in the wall were a stark reminder that the battle was far from over. The entities were growing bolder, more aggressive, and William, as powerful as he was, couldn't hold them back forever. As the morning light began to filter through the front windows, casting long, pale shadows across the store, I knew our time was running out. The stop and go was a battleground, and the war was escalating. And I had a terrifying feeling that the next time William might not be enough. The days that followed the wall incident were a blur of heightened anxiety. Mark, now a full convert to the store's terrifying reality, moved with a new, almost frantic energy. He meticulously followed every rule, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his ears straining for the slightest whisper. He even started carrying a small, worn crucifix in his pocket, a desperate, tangible comfort against the unseen. I didn't comment. We all had our coping mechanisms. Mine was the thought of Emma and Jacob, a burning need to get home to them every morning. One night, the air in the stop and go felt unusually still, a suffocating quiet that was far more unsettling than any noise. The usual hum of the refrigerators seemed muted, distant. Even the fluorescent lights, usually a harsh, unwavering glow, flickered with an almost imperceptible tremor, casting dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with a life of their own. I was at the register counting the till when I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, even though no one was behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the empty aisle stretching into the dimness. Mark, who was sweeping near the back, paused, his broom held aloft. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, a low guttural growl emanated from the ceiling directly above us. It wasn't the familiar distant rumble from the bathroom or the storage room. This was closer, deeper, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the building. Dust motes illuminated by the flickering lights danced in the air, disturbed by an unseen force. Then the shelves began to shift. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the metal racks holding bags of chips and boxes of cereal began to slide, scraping against the linoleum floor with a chilling screech. They moved inwards, narrowing the aisles, creating a labyrinth of steel and cardboard. Mark dropped his broom with a clatter, his jaw slack. "Rule 9. I said, my voice tight, a desperate whisper. "If the store changes, don't touch anything. Don't try to fix it. Just get to the counter." We scrambled, navigating the shifting aisles, the shelves groaning and scraping as they continued to move, blocking our path, creating new, impossible corridors. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of dust, and something else, something metallic and acrid. It felt like the store was alive, rearranging its own internal organs, trapping us within its shifting, malevolent embrace. We finally reached the counter, breathless, our backs pressed against the cool metal. The shelves continued to move, forming a tight, impenetrable maze around us, leaving only a small open space directly in front of the counter. The growling from the ceiling intensified, a hungry, predatory sound. Suddenly, the lights above us flickered violently, then died, plunging the store into near-total darkness. Only the faint emergency lights, a sickly green glow, illuminated the terrifying scene. The shadows, now freed from the harsh glare of the fluorescence, seemed to deepen, to writhe with an unseen life. From the darkness of the newly formed maze, a new sound emerged. A wet, slithering noise, like something dragging itself across a slick surface. It was coming from within the aisles, moving closer, circling us. Mark whimpered, his hand clutching the crucifix in his pocket so tightly his knuckles were white. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice raw with terror. I didn't answer. I just stared into the shifting darkness, my hand instinctively reaching for the small, cylindrical device beneath the counter, the one with the glowing blue button. I had never used it, but tonight I had a chilling premonition that I would. The slithering sound grew louder, closer. I could hear the faint thump-thump of something heavy dragging itself along the floor. Then from the darkness of the maze, a single glowing red eye appeared. It was large, unblinking, and filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. It blinked once slowly, then another eye appeared beside it, then another, until a dozen glowing red eyes stared at us from the darkness, unblinking, predatory. William appeared, materializing silently between us and the shifting maze. He stood perfectly still, his back to us, facing the glowing red eyes. The slithering sound stopped. The air grew even colder, thick with an unspoken tension. William raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed a finger at the glowing red eyes. A faint, shimmering blue light emanated from his fingertip, a barely visible aura that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. The red eyes blinked in unison, then slowly, one by one, they began to recede, fading back into the shadows of the maze. The slithering sound resumed, but it was fainter now, moving away from us. The shelves, with a series of groans and scrapes, began to shift back to their original positions, slowly, painstakingly, until the aisles were once again open and clear. The emergency lights flickered, then the main fluorescents hummed back to life, bathing the store in their harsh, unwavering glow. William turned his hooded head, tilting slightly towards us. Then he melted back into the shadows near the front door. His silent vigil resumed. Mark stared at the now normal aisles, then at the spot where William had been, his face a mask of utter disbelief and terror. He saved us again. He stammered, his voice hoarse. "What are those things?" "They're the architects," I said, my voice flat. "They build the maze. They try to trap us." I didn't elaborate. There was no need. Mark had seen it with his own eyes. He had felt the cold, heard the slithering, witnessed William's silent power. For the rest of the night, Mark was completely silent. He moved like a ghost, his eyes wide, his movements jerky. He was no longer just a terrified believer. He was a haunted one. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky and the morning crew arrived, Mark looked utterly drained. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sam," he said as we walked out to the parking lot, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think I can do this anymore." I just nodded, my own exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "I know," I said. But you will, because you have to. I watched him get into his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't offer a mock salute this time. He just drove away, leaving me alone in the growing light, the chilling memory of the shifting maze and the glowing red eyes still fresh in my mind. The stop and go had claimed another piece of him, and I knew with a cold certainty that the architects were just getting started. The days following the architect's incident were the quietest I'd ever experienced at the stop and go. Mark barely spoke, his eyes constantly scanning the ceiling, the walls, the very air around us. He moved with a new, almost desperate efficiency, as if trying to outrun the unseen horrors that now haunted his every step. The crucifix in his pocket seemed to be clutched tighter than ever. I understood. We were both just trying to survive. One night, the silence in the store was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. Even the distant hum of the refrigerators seemed to have vanished. The air was still heavy and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang like old blood. I was wiping down the counter, my movements slow and deliberate, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a sigh carried on a phantom breeze. It seemed to come from the back of the store near the storage room. I froze, my rag suspended in midair. Mark, who was meticulously arranging candy bars on a shelf, also stopped, his head cocked to one side. His eyes met mine, wide and questioning. The whisper grew louder, coalescing into a distinct, mournful sound. It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading, calling out a name. Jason! Jason! My blood ran cold. Jason, the employee who had vanished 2 years ago. Did you hear that? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. He started to move towards the sound, a desperate, morbid curiosity pulling him. Rule 10. I said, my voice sharp, cutting through the oppressive silence. If you hear a name called, don't answer. Don't acknowledge it. Don't go towards it. Mark stopped, his hand hovering in the air, his eyes fixed on the storage room door. The voice grew more insistent, more desperate. Jason, please, where are you? It sounded so real, so full of sorrow. It tugged at something deep inside, a primal urge to comfort, to help. But I knew better. I had seen what happened to those who answered the call. Suddenly, the voice shifted. It wasn't just calling Jason anymore. It was calling my name. Sam. Sam, please help me. It was my mother's voice, clear and desperate, filled with a terror that twisted my gut. My heart lurched. Emma and Jacob were with her tonight. A cold, paralyzing fear gripped me. I took a step, my feet moving without conscious thought, drawn by the desperate plea. My mother. Something had happened to her. I had to go. Sam. Mark's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the illusion. He was standing directly in front of me, his hands on my shoulders, his eyes wide and pleading. It's not real. Remember the rule. His words, his touch broke the spell. The voice of my mother twisted, becoming distorted, guttural, a mocking, inhuman shriek that echoed through the store. It was no longer a plea for help. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. The storage room door, previously closed, slowly creaked open, revealing a sliver of inky blackness within. From that darkness, a faint shimmering outline began to emerge. It was vaguely humanoid, but its form was indistinct, wavering like heat haze. It seemed to be reaching out, a long, shadowy arm extending from the void. William appeared, materializing silently between us and the storage room door. He stood perfectly still, his back to us, facing the emerging entity. The shriek from the storage room intensified, a frustrated, angry roar. William raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed a finger at the shimmering outline. A faint, shimmering blue light emanated from his fingertip, a barely visible aura that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. The shadowy arm recoiled, and the shimmering outline began to recede back into the storage room. The shriek faded, replaced by a low, frustrated growl. The storage room door slowly creaked shut, the sound echoing in the sudden, heavy silence. William stood there for a long moment, his hand still raised. Then he lowered it and melted back into the shadows near the front door. His silent vigil resumed. Mark stared at the closed storage room door, then at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. It sounded just like her. He whispered, his voice trembling. My mom. I nodded, my own heart still pounding, a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I know, I said, my voice hoarse. It sounded just like mine. The entities were learning. They were adapting. They were using our deepest fears, our most primal connections against us. For the rest of the night, Mark and I moved in a silent, terrified dance. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper sent a fresh wave of dread through us. The store felt like a living, breathing entity, constantly testing us, constantly trying to break our resolve. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky and the morning crew arrived, Mark looked utterly drained. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, haunted. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Sam," he said as we walked out to the parking lot, his voice barely a whisper. What if it gets through? What if William isn't enough?" I just nodded, my own exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "Then we fight," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We fight until we can't anymore." I watched him get into his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't offer a mock salute this time. He just drove away, leaving me alone in the growing light, the chilling echo of my mother's voice still ringing in my ears. The stop and go was a constant battle, and the entities were getting smarter, more insidious. And I knew with a cold certainty that the next time the call might be too strong to resist. The incident with the echoing voices left a deeper scar than any physical manifestation. Mark was a ghost of his former self, his eyes constantly darting, his movements jerky. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was only to confirm a rule or to ask a hushed, terrified question about William's capabilities. The crucifix in his pocket was now clutched almost constantly. I understood. The entities were no longer just a threat to our bodies. They were a threat to our minds, to our very sanity. One night, the air in the stop and go felt thick, almost viscous, as if the very atmosphere had become heavy with an unseen presence. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unnatural intensity, casting harsh, unwavering shadows that seemed to cling to every surface. I was restocking the refrigerated drinks, the cold air a brief, sharp comfort against the growing unease when I noticed it. The labels on the soda bottles were shifting, not just moving, but changing. The familiar red of a cola label would bleed into a sickly green, then morph into a swirling pattern of black and white. The text would twist, becoming an indecipherable script, then dissolve into a series of unsettling symbols. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the labels continued their grotesque dance. "Mark," I whispered, my voice tight. "Look at the sodas." Mark, who was at the register, looked over. His eyes widened and he took a step back, his hand flying to his mouth. "What the hell?" He choked out, his voice a strained whisper. The phenomenon wasn't limited to the sodas. As I looked around, I saw it everywhere. The cereal boxes on the shelves were rippling, their images distorting into grotesque caricatures. The price tags on the candy bars were twisting into impossible shapes. The very floor tiles seemed to undulate their patterns, shifting and reforming into unsettling geometric designs that made my head spin. Rule 11. I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion, a practiced calm masking the rising panic in my chest. "If reality shifts, don't look too closely. Don't try to make sense of it. Just keep moving." Mark, for once, didn't question. He just nodded, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. We continued our tasks, moving through the store. But the shifting reality followed us, a relentless, insidious presence. It felt like the store was unraveling its very fabric, dissolving into a chaotic, nightmarish landscape. As I walked past the magazine rack, the covers seemed to ride the faces of celebrities, contorting into monstrous visages, their eyes following me with an unnerving intensity. The headlines twisted into nonsensical, terrifying phrases. I felt a strange pull, a morbid fascination urging me to pick one up to try and decipher the hidden messages. My hand instinctively reached out, a primal urge to understand, to confront. "Sam," Mark's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the oppressive illusion. He was standing at the end of the aisle, his face pale, his eyes fixed on me. "Don't touch it." His voice broke through the trance. I pulled my hand back, my fingers tingling as if I had touched something electrified. The magazine covers seemed to snarl in response, their images twisting into even more grotesque forms. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "It tries to draw you in," I said, my voice flat. "It wants you to lose your grip on what's real. It wants you to become part of its chaos." I didn't need to explain what would happen if you did. The thought of being trapped in a perpetually shifting, nightmarish reality was a horror far worse than any physical threat. We continued our shift, the shifting reality, a constant, unsettling backdrop. It never stopped, never faded, just ebbed and flowed, a living, breathing entity within the walls of the stop and go. Mark kept glancing at everything, his eyes wide, his movements jerky. He was clearly struggling to maintain his sanity, to not succumb to the terrifying illusion. Around 3:00 a.m., the shifting reality reached a fever pitch. The entire store seemed to be melting, dissolving into a swirling vortex of impossible colors and distorted shapes. The aisles twisted into impossible angles, the shelves seemed to float in midair, and the very floor beneath our feet undulated like a stormy sea. The air was filled with a cacophony of disembodied whispers, laughter, and screams, all blending into a single maddening roar. Suddenly, a section of the wall near the back of the store where the cleaning supplies were kept began to ripple like water disturbed by an unseen force. A shimmering, translucent membrane began to form, stretching across the wall, pulsating with an eerie internal light. It looked like a window, but a window into something utterly alien and terrifying. Mark gasped, his eyes fixed on the pulsating membrane. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the maddening roar. I didn't answer. I just stared at the membrane, a cold dread settling deep in my bones. This was new. This was different. The entities weren't just trying to break through anymore. They were trying to open a gateway. William appeared, materializing silently between us and the pulsating membrane. He stood perfectly still, his back to us, facing the shimmering gateway. The maddening roar from the store intensified, a desperate, angry surge. William raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and placed his palm flat against the pulsating membrane. A low, resonant hum emanated from William, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, pushing back against the chaotic reality. The membrane rippled violently, its internal light flickering, then slowly, painstakingly, it began to shrink, to recede, until it vanished back into the wall, leaving only a faint, shimmering outline. The maddening roar immediately faded, replaced by a frustrated, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the walls. The shifting reality slowly began to stabilize. The labels on the sodas returned to normal, the cereal boxes regained their familiar images, and the floor tiles settled back into their mundane patterns. The lights stopped flickering, returning to their harsh, unwavering glow. William stood there for a long moment, his hand still raised. Then he lowered it and melted back into the shadows near the front door. His silent vigil resumed. Mark stared at the now normal wall, then at the spot where William had been, his face, a mask of utter disbelief and terror. He closed it. He stammered, his voice hoarse. He actually closed it. "For now," I said, my voice flat. The faint, shimmering outline on the wall was a stark reminder that the gateway had been there. The entities were no longer just trying to break through. They were trying to establish a permanent foothold. And William, as powerful as he was, couldn't hold them back forever. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky and the morning crew arrived, Mark looked utterly drained. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, haunted. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Sam," he said as we walked out to the parking lot, his voice barely a whisper. What if he can't close it next time?" I just nodded, my own exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "Then we'll be in a lot of trouble," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A lot of trouble." I watched him get into his car, his movement slow and deliberate. He didn't offer a mock salute this time. He just drove away, leaving me alone in the growing light, the chilling memory of the pulsating gateway, and the maddening roar still fresh in my mind. The stop and go was a constant battle, and the entities were getting bolder, more desperate. And I knew with a cold certainty that the next time the gateway might open completely. The days following the gateway incident were a suffocating blend of exhaustion and dread. Mark was a shell of his former self, his eyes hollow, his movements almost robotic. He followed every rule with a desperate, almost religious fervor, but the spark of life, even the spark of fear, seemed to have been extinguished. He was just existing. I understood. The constant assault on our sanity, the relentless push of the unseen, was taking its toll on both of us. One night, the air in the stop and go felt charged, heavy with an electric tension that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frantic, almost buzzing intensity, casting sharp, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with an unseen energy. I was at the register trying to focus on the mundane task of counting the till, when I felt a sudden sharp pain in my head, like an ice pick being driven into my temple. I gasped, clutching my head. Mark, who was sweeping near the back, dropped his broom with a clatter. He looked at me, his face contorted in pain, his hands pressed against his own temples. My head. He choked out his voice, a strained whisper. It feels like it's going to explode. The pain intensified, a relentless, throbbing agony that seemed to synchronize with the frantic buzzing of the lights. It wasn't just a headache. It was an assault, a psychic scream tearing through our minds. I could hear faint, distorted whispers, not from the walls this time, but from inside my head, a cacophony of alien voices trying to force their way in. Rule 12. I gasped, my voice barely audible above the internal roar. If the store screams, don't fight it, don't resist. Just focus on one thing, one real thing. Mark, his face pale and slick with sweat, nodded frantically. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands still pressed against his head, trying to block out the unbearable noise. I closed my own eyes, trying to focus on Emma and Jacob, on their faces, their laughter, anything to ground myself in reality. But the pain was too intense, the whispers too insistent. The store itself seemed to be screaming now. The shelves rattled violently, bottles clinked together, and the very floor beneath our feet vibrated with a terrifying intensity. It felt like the building was tearing itself apart, or perhaps being torn apart by something else. Suddenly, a section of the ceiling above the main aisle began to crack, a loud, sickening crack that echoed through the store. A large chunk of plaster detached itself and crashed to the floor, sending up a cloud of dust. Through the gaping hole, I could see not the familiar dark of the attic, but a swirling vortex of impossible colors, a kaleidoscope of light and shadow that pulsed with a terrifying alien energy. Mark screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. He pointed a trembling finger at the vortex. "What is that?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. I didn't answer. I just stared at the swirling vortex, a cold dread settling deep in my bones. This was new. This was different. The entities weren't just trying to open a gateway anymore. They were trying to tear a hole in reality. From the swirling vortex, a long, slender tendril, black and glistening, began to descend. It moved with an unnerving grace, slowly unfurling, reaching down towards us. It was followed by another and another, until a dozen black tendrils dangled from the vortex, swaying gently like monstrous predatory vines. William appeared, materializing silently between us and the descending tendrils. He stood perfectly still, his back to us, facing the swirling vortex and its monstrous appendages. The psychic scream from the store intensified, a desperate, angry roar. William raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed a finger at the swirling vortex. A low, resonant hum emanated from William, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, pushing back against the chaotic energy. The black tendrils recoiled, writhing violently, and the swirling vortex began to shrink, its impossible colors fading, its alien energy diminishing. The psychic scream immediately faded, replaced by a frustrated, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within the vortex. The tendrils retracted, and the vortex slowly, painstakingly began to close the cracks in the ceiling, sealing themselves with a soft, grinding sound. William stood there for a long moment, his hand still raised. Then he lowered it and melted back into the shadows near the front door. His silent vigil resumed. Mark stared at the now intact ceiling, then at the spot where William had been, his face, a mask of utter disbelief and terror. He closed the sky. He stammered, his voice hoarse. He actually closed the sky. For now. I said, my voice flat. The faint, almost invisible lines where the cracks had been were a stark reminder that the hole had been there. The entities were no longer just trying to establish a permanent foothold. They were trying to break through completely. And William, as powerful as he was, couldn't hold them back forever. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky and the morning crew arrived, Mark looked utterly broken. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, haunted. He looked like he hadn't slept in months. "Sam," he said, as we walked out to the parking lot, his voice barely a whisper. "What happens when he can't close it anymore?" I just nodded, my own exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "Then we'll find out," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We'll all find out." I watched him get into his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't offer a mock salute this time. He just drove away, leaving me alone in the growing light, the chilling memory of the screaming store and the swirling vortex still fresh in my mind. The stop and go was a constant battle, and the entities were getting bolder, more desperate, more powerful. And I knew with a cold certainty that the next time the hole might open completely, and there would be no closing it. The days following the screaming store incident were a descent into a new kind of hell. Mark was a ghost moving through the motions, his eyes vacant. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was only in hushed, terrified whispers asking if I thought tonight would be the night. I had no answers for him. My own sleep was plagued by nightmares of swirling voids and disembodied screams. The stop and go was no longer just a job. It was a cage, and the bars were slowly, inexorably closing in. One night, the air in the stop and go felt impossibly heavy, thick, with a palpable sense of anticipation, like the calm before a monstrous storm. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, ominous thrum, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with an unseen life. I was at the register, my hands trembling slightly as I counted the till, when I felt a sudden, intense cold radiating from the back of the store, a cold that seeped into my bones. I looked up, my gaze drawn to the storage room door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of inky blackness visible within. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from inside, casting an eerie glow on the floor. Mark, who was sweeping near the front, stopped dead, his broom clattering to the floor. His eyes were wide, fixed on the storage room door. From within the storage room, a low, guttural growl emanated, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floor, shaking the shelves, rattling the bottles on display. It was a sound of immense power, of ancient hunger. Rule 13. I whispered, my voice tight, a desperate plea. If the storage room opens, don't look inside. Don't approach it. Just get to the counter. Now. Mark, his face pale and slick with sweat, nodded frantically. He scrambled towards the counter, his movements jerky, desperate. I followed, my eyes fixed on the storage room door, a morbid fascination warring with the primal urge to flee. As we reached the counter, the storage room door slowly, agonizingly began to swing open. The sickly green light intensified, bathing the back of the store in an unholy glow. From within the darkness, a shape began to emerge. It was massive, far too large to fit through the doorway, yet it continued to push forward, its form, shifting, distorting, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to accommodate its impossible bulk. It was vaguely humanoid, but its limbs were too long, too thin, ending in razor-sharp claws that scraped against the floor with a chilling shriek. Its head was elongated, featureless, save for two glowing red eyes that burned with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The creature moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its impossible form unfolding into the store. It was covered in a slick black membrane that seemed to ripple and shift, revealing glimpses of pulsating veins and sinews beneath. A low, guttural hiss emanated from it, a sound that seemed to tear at the very air. Mark screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. He pointed a trembling finger at the creature. "What is that?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. I didn't answer. I just stared at the creature, a cold dread settling deep in my bones. This was it. This was what all the rules, all the warnings, all the terror had been leading to. This was the true horror of the stop and go. The creature took another step, its massive form filling the aisle, its glowing red eyes fixed on us. The air grew impossibly cold, thick with the stench of ozone and something else. Something ancient and rotten. It raised one of its clawed hands slowly, deliberately, and pointed a long, slender finger at Mark. Mark whimpered, his body trembling uncontrollably. He tried to move, to run, but he seemed frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. William appeared, materializing silently between us and the monstrous creature. He stood perfectly still, his back to us, facing the impossible horror. The creature hissed a frustrated, angry sound, its glowing red eyes narrowing. William raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed a finger at the creature. A low, resonant hum emanated from William, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, pushing back against the creature's oppressive presence. The creature recoiled slightly, its black membrane rippling violently, its glowing red eyes flickering. William took a step forward, then another, slowly advancing towards the creature. The creature hissed again, a sound of pure malice, but it also took a step back, its massive form seeming to shrink slightly under William's unwavering gaze. The creature let out a frustrated roar, a sound that shook the very foundations of the store. Then it turned, its impossible form twisting and distorting, and began to retreat back into the storage room. The sickly green light flickered, then faded, and the storage room door slowly, agonizingly began to close, leaving only a sliver of darkness. William stood there for a long moment, his hand still raised. Then he lowered it, and melted back into the shadows near the front door. His silent vigil resumed. Mark stared at the now closed storage room door, then at the spot where William had been, his face, a mask of utter disbelief and terror. He made it go away. He stammered, his voice hoarse. He actually made it go away. For now. I said, my voice flat. The lingering cold, the faint stench of ozone, and the memory of those glowing red eyes were a stark reminder that it had been here. The entities were no longer just trying to break through. They were manifesting. And William, as powerful as he was, couldn't hold them back forever. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky and the morning crew arrived, Mark looked utterly broken. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, haunted. He looked like he had seen hell and barely escaped. "Sam," he said as we walked out to the parking lot, his voice barely a whisper. "What was that thing?" I just shook my head, my own exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "I don't know," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But it's getting closer." I watched him get into his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't offer a mock salute this time. He just drove away, leaving me alone in the growing light, the chilling memory of the impossible creature, and its glowing red eyes still fresh in my mind. The stop and go was a constant battle, and the entities were no longer just lurking in the shadows. They were stepping into the light. And I knew with a cold certainty that the next time it might not retreat. The night after the creature's manifestation, Mark didn't show up for his shift. I called his phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. A cold dread settled in my stomach. He had finally broken. Or worse. I worked the shift alone, every shadow a potential threat, every creak of the building a harbinger of doom. William was a constant, silent presence, but even his stillness felt more ominous than usual. When Thomas arrived for his shift, I told him about Mark. He listened, his face grim, then simply nodded. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice flat. "Just focus on your shift tonight, Sam. It's going to be a difficult one." His words were a chilling confirmation of my worst fears. That night, the stop and go felt like a tomb. The air was heavy, suffocating, thick with an oppressive silence that pressed in on me from all sides. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, almost mournful drone, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with an unseen life. I was at the register, my hands trembling slightly as I counted the till, when I felt a sudden, intense cold radiating from every direction, a cold that seeped into my bones, making my teeth chatter. Then the whispers began. Not from the walls, not from inside my head, but from everywhere at once. A cacophony of faint, distorted voices speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. Yet their meaning was clear. They were here. I looked up, my gaze sweeping across the store. Nothing. Just the familiar aisles, the mundane products. But the whispers intensified, growing louder, more insistent, a maddening chorus that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Suddenly, the front doors, which I had locked precisely at 11:00 p.m., began to rattle violently. The heavy deadbolts groaned, straining against an unseen force. The glass panes flexed inwards, groaning under immense pressure. A low, guttural growl emanated from outside, a sound of immense power, of ancient hunger now unbridled. "Rule 14. I whispered, my voice tight, a desperate plea. "If the doors break, don't look outside. Don't try to stop it. Just get to the back room, now." I scrambled towards the back room, my movements jerky, desperate. The rattling of the doors intensified, becoming a deafening roar. The glass groaned, a high-pitched shriek that tore at my ears. I could hear the wood of the doorframe splintering, the metal of the locks twisting. As I reached the back room, the front doors exploded inwards. With a deafening crash, shards of glass flew across the store, glittering in the dim light. The heavy deadbolts snapped, tearing through the wood, leaving jagged splinters. A wave of impossibly cold air rushed in, carrying with it the stench of ozone and something else, something ancient and rotten. Through the gaping maw of the shattered doors, I could see nothing but an inky blackness, a void that seemed to swallow the light. But from that void, a sound emerged. A wet, slithering noise, like something massive dragging itself across a slick surface. It was followed by a series of heavy thumps, as if something impossibly large was pulling itself into the store. I slammed the backroom door shut, fumbling with the locks, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grasp the cold metal. I threw every bolt, every latch, every chain, desperate to create a barrier, however flimsy, against what was coming. The sounds from the main store intensified. The slithering, the thumping, the guttural growls. I could hear the shelves groaning, the products crashing to the floor. It sounded like a hurricane tearing through the store, but a hurricane made of flesh and malice. Then a new sound. A high-pitched, piercing shriek that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. It was followed by a series of rapid, violent impacts like something impossibly heavy being thrown against the walls. William appeared, materializing silently in the small back room with me. He stood perfectly still, his back to the door, facing the sounds of chaos from the main store. The shriek intensified, a desperate, angry sound followed by a series of guttural roars. William raised his hand slowly, deliberately, and placed his palm flat against the back room door. A low, resonant hum emanated from William, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, pushing back against the chaos. The sounds from the main store seemed to lessen, the growls becoming more distant, the impacts less frequent. But then a new sound. A wet, tearing sound like flesh being ripped apart. It was followed by a choked gurgle and then silence. An absolute terrifying silence. William stood there for a long moment, his hand still pressed against the door, his body radiating a faint, shimmering blue light. Then slowly, he lowered his hand. The blue light faded. He turned, his hooded head tilting slightly towards me. He didn't speak. He never did. But his silence was more terrifying than any words. It was the silence of a battle fought and perhaps lost. I stared at the backroom door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The silence from the main store was absolute chilling. What was out there? What had happened? William turned and melted back into the shadows, not towards the front door this time, but deeper into the back room towards a small, unmarked door I had never noticed before. He opened it, and a faint, shimmering light emanated from within. He stepped through, and the door slowly closed behind him, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. I stood there for a long moment, my body trembling uncontrollably. The Stop and Go was no longer just a store, it was a battlefield. And the battle had just begun. The front doors were shattered, the silence was deafening. And William, our silent protector, had retreated into an unknown realm. I was alone. And I knew with a cold certainty that whatever was out there, it was coming for me.